Black and Gold Nation. Something big is quietly unfolding behind the scenes in Pittsburgh right now. And if you've been tracking the Steelers' pre-draft visits closely, you're starting to see a pattern that not everyone is catching yet. Because this doesn't look like a team locked in on taking a wide receiver in the first round. Not even close. In fact, all the signs are pointing in a completely different direction, one that could catch a lot of fans off guard. If you're seeing it too, drop a "here we go" in the comments. When you break down the visits the Steelers have made so far, the trend becomes hard to ignore. The early wide receiver visits weren't even top-tier prospects. Names like Jeff Caldwell and Kendrick Laws came in first, both projected as late day 3 options. That alone already raises an eyebrow because historically, when the Steelers are truly locked in on a first-round target, they make it obvious through their process. The so-called trifecta, the pre-draft visit, combined meeting, and presence at Pro Day, has often been a strong indicator. But this year, that pattern just hasn't shown up in the same way. Then came Denzel Boston, the first receiver who could realistically be in the first-round conversation. But even with him, there's a strong sense that he might be more of a second-round value depending on how the board falls. And right after that, the Steelers brought in Skylar Bell out of UConn, a player widely viewed as a solid second-round prospect, not a first-round lock. When you stack that sequence together, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like direction. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The Steelers have already used over half of their available non-local pre-draft visits, and the majority of those names are not first-round players. Across multiple positions, cornerback, defensive line, quarterback, linebacker, the pattern repeats itself. Late round and mid-round talent dominating the list. That suggests something deeper in how this front office is evaluating the class. So what does that mean? It could mean the Steelers are looking at the depth of this wide receiver class and seeing value that extends well beyond the first round. Instead of forcing a pick early, they might be thinking, why not secure a premium player at another position first and still come back and get a playmaker later? This approach actually lines up with the franchise's history. For years, the Steelers built elite wide receiver groups without spending first-round picks. Antonio Brown, Emmanuel Sanders, Mike Wallace, all mid to late round selections. Even Juju Smith-Schuster came in the second round. This organization has consistently shown confidence in its ability to develop talent at that position. And when you look at someone like Skylar Bell, you start to understand why. He's explosive, dangerous after the catch, and one of the most productive receivers in college football in terms of yards after catch. That kind of skill set fits perfectly into a modern offense and doesn't require a first-round investment. At the same time, the Steelers are clearly doing their homework on other impact positions. The visit from Emmanuel McNeil-Warren is a perfect example. A big physical safety with playmaking ability, strong instincts, and a knack for forcing turnovers. That's the type of player who can anchor a defense. Bringing him in signals that the team is seriously considering adding a difference maker on that side of the ball early in the draft. And that opens up a lot of possibilities. What if the Steelers decide to prioritize a top defensive talent in the first round, then circle back and grab a receiver like Skylar Bell or another high-value option in the second or third? Suddenly you're addressing multiple needs without reaching for a position just because of perceived urgency. Even some of the lesser-known visits add to this picture. Jacoby Thomas, a safety with ball production and the ability to disguise coverage, and Jack Kelly, a pass-rushing linebacker who brings pressure and special teams value. These are depth pieces, but they reflect a team that's building out its roster with intention across all levels. All of this points to a front office that is being patient, calculated, and very aware of where the real value lies in this draft. They're not chasing headlines. They're not forcing a quarterback or a wide receiver just to fill a narrative. They're letting the board come to them, and more importantly, they're trusting their ability to develop talent in key areas. But here's the big question that comes out of all of this. If the Steelers truly believe they can find wide receiver value later in the draft, are they setting themselves up to make a statement pick at another position in the first round? And would you be comfortable with that strategy? If that's the direction they're leaning toward, then what we're really looking at is a front office that's prioritizing long-term roster balance over short-term noise. And that's where things start to get even more intriguing, because once you accept the idea that wide receiver might not be the first round priority, the entire draft board opens up in a completely different way. Think about the potential ripple effect. If the Steelers pass on a receiver early, that likely means they're targeting a premium position where elite talent is harder to find later. Positions like cornerback, offensive line, defensive line, or safety. And when you factor in a player like Emmanuel McNeil-Warren visiting the facility, it's not just a routine check-in. That's a serious evaluation of a player who could step in and contribute immediately. Warren brings size, physicality, and a natural ability to create turnovers. He's not just a coverage guy. He's disruptive, he forces fumbles, he reads plays well, and he can impact both the passing game and run defense. Even without elite top-end speed, his length and instincts allow him to close windows and make quarterbacks hesitate. That kind of presence in the secondary could completely change the identity of the defense. Now imagine pairing that type of defensive addition with what the Steelers already have. You start building a unit that can dictate tempo, create takeaways, and give your offense more opportunities. That's the kind of impact a first-round defensive pick can bring, and it might outweigh the immediate flash of drafting a wide receiver early. At the same time, the depth at wide receiver continues to make this strategy more appealing. We're talking about a class where players like Skylar Bell aren't even near the top of the rankings, yet still bring explosive ability, strong route running, and game-changing potential after the catch. That's rare depth, and teams that recognize it can take advantage. There are also other names sitting in that second to third round range, players who in a different class might be pushing for late first round consideration. That creates an opportunity window. Instead of reaching for the 5th or 6th best receiver in the first round, the Steelers could land a top tier talent at another position and still walk away with a receiver who fits their system perfectly. And let's not ignore another key layer here. Flexibility. By not locking themselves into one position early, the Steelers keep their options open. If a top prospect unexpectedly falls, whether it's a receiver, a defender, or even an offensive lineman, they're in position to react instead of being forced into a predetermined plan. There's also the trade factor. If the board doesn't fall the way they want, this kind of approach gives them the freedom to move back, pick up additional assets, and still target the same tier of players they were already comfortable with. And in a draft where depth is one of the defining traits, accumulating picks becomes even more valuable. What stands out most in all of this is the discipline. This isn't a team chasing hype. This is a team reading the board, understanding positional value, and trusting its own development pipeline. That's not always the most exciting approach on draft night, but it's often the one that pays off months and even years down the line. So when you step back and look at everything, the visits, the player profiles, the lack of clear first-round wide receiver focus, it really does feel like the Steelers are setting up for a move that might catch a lot of people off guard. Not because it's reckless, but because it's calculated in a way that goes against the expectations surrounding this team right now. And if they do go in that direction, if they pass on a wide receiver early and double down on value elsewhere, it's going to spark a huge reaction across the fan base. Some will love the patience, others will question whether they're passing on immediate offensive firepower, but that's the gamble. And it's one the Steelers seem more than willing to take. And the more you think about it, the more this feels like one of those defining drafts where the Steelers quietly reshape the identity of the roster without making the obvious move everyone expects. Because if this plan hits the way they envision it, you're not just talking about adding a receiver or a defender. You're talking about building a more complete, more balanced team, one that doesn't rely on a single position group to carry the load. That's how sustainable contenders are built in this league. And let's be real for a second. The Steelers don't operate like most teams. They don't panic. They don't chase trends. They stick to their evaluations, trust their board, and more often than not, they end up finding value where others aren't even looking. That's exactly what this approach feels like right now. So if draft night comes and that first round pick is not a wide receiver, don't be surprised. In fact, based on everything we're seeing, maybe that should be the expectation. Now it all comes down to execution. Can they hit on that first pick at another position? Can they come back and find that explosive playmaker later in the draft? And most importantly, will this strategy actually elevate the team to the next level? That's the part we won't know until the season starts. But the foundation is being built right now. because that decision, more than anything else, is going to define how this entire draft class is viewed moving forward. If they pass on a wide receiver in the first round and that player they select on defense, or the offensive line, turns into a cornerstone piece, then suddenly the narrative flips completely. What looked like a risk on draft night becomes a masterclass in roster building. That's how quickly perception changes in the NFL. But there's also the other side of it. If the receiver they pass on becomes a star somewhere else, and the later round pick doesn't develop the way they hoped, then the criticism is going to be loud. That's the reality of this kind of strategy. The margin for error gets thinner, and every decision is magnified. Still, when you go back to everything we've seen so far, the visits, the types of players they're evaluating, the lack of urgency around top-tier wide receivers, it doesn't feel accidental. It feels intentional. It feels like a front office that has already identified where the true value is in this class and is positioning itself to take advantage of it. And there's one more layer that makes this even more interesting: adaptability during the draft itself. Let's say they stick to this plan, but then something unexpected happens. A top receiver falls further than anticipated. A run on defensive players changes the board. A trade opportunity opens up that wasn't there before. Because they haven't boxed themselves into one position, the Steelers can pivot instantly. That flexibility could end up being their biggest weapon. And don't forget, hitting on a second or third round wide receiver isn't just a possibility for this franchise. It's almost part of their identity. They've done it time and time again. So internally, there's likely a real belief that they don't need to spend premium capital to find production at that position. At that point, it becomes less about if they get a receiver and more about when and which one fits best. And that's where names like Skylar Bell start to carry more weight. A player who might not generate first-round buzz, but brings explosiveness, strong route running, and serious yards after catch ability. In the right system, with the right development, that kind of player can become a major contributor, and at a fraction of the cost of a first-round pick. So now you're looking at a scenario where the Steelers could realistically walk away from this draft with a high-impact defender, a dynamic playmaker at receiver, and added depth across key positions, all without forcing a single pick. That's the blueprint they seem to be building toward. And if that's the case, then draft night isn't just about who they pick. It's about whether fans are willing to trust a process that doesn't follow the obvious path. Because sometimes the smartest move is the one that doesn't make headlines right away. And this is where things really start to separate casual expectations from how front offices actually operate. Because from the outside, it always feels simple. We need a wide receiver, go get one early. But inside the building, it's never that one-dimensional. It's about value, depth of class, long-term